Um, all right, everybody. Hello. Still waiting for a few more people to log in. But I'm gonna share it. So we were gonna record this session. So as I start playing, hitting the record button. Voice with public chat, and we're looking forward to the session too. So I'm going to start the recording button, and here we go. 1, 2, and 3. Go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Making a Difference Speaker Series session. My name is Alicia Collins. I work with Brilliant Labs as the Director of Creative Learning, and I host a special speaker series. I'm very excited to be here with you all. And today we have a very, very special guest, Fiona Bell. Fiona is a PhD student at the University of Colorado Boulder and works with the Living Matter Lab. Her work focuses on creating technologically innovative and yet ecologically sustainable interfaces. So when I noticed her work, I was just blown away. I hope you got a chance to see her website beforehand, but they're just awesome projects. So we are very, very thrilled to have Fiona here. Welcome, Fiona. Her work focuses on creating technologically
Hello,
innovative
thank
and yet
you so
ecologically
much
sustainable
for having
interfaces.
me today.
So when
I'm
I
very
noticed her
excited
work, I was just
to
blown
share with
away.
you
I
all
hope you got a
my
chance to see
work
her website beforehand, but
and let
they're
me
just
get my
awesome projects. So we are very,
presentation
very thrilled
up
to
and
have you here.
going.
Welcome, Fiona.
Hello, thank you so much for hopefully everybody can see. Um, Yet again, thank you, Alicia, for the introduction. My name is Fiona Bell. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I am coming from the Boulder community, which is on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. And I am really excited to share with you all my work with designing with biomaterials. So I'm going to go over many, many different materials I work with today, and hopefully you all will learn a lot. So before I dive into my work, I want to introduce myself. So my work happens in biological human-computer interaction. So this combines the field of biodesign, which is all about applying biomaterials to traditional design fields like architectural design, fashion design, product design. I also incorporate material science, which is all about material testing, figuring out the properties of materials, determining which types of materials are best used for different types of applications. And I also combine this field of human computer interaction, which is all about the study of how humans basically interact with their technology. So we're really looking at these interfaces that enable humans to actually use a computer. So I think a great example of my work is this SCOBY breastplate. So SCOBY is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And we grow SCOBY within this pool of tea. And basically, the SCOBY, that bacteria and yeast, eats away all the sugars in the tea and forms this big gelatinous biofilm that you see being harvested in this video. And so this is the biodesign part of my work. You know, SCOBY is a grown material. It is living, it is live. We have to care for it, we have to feed it, and it is completely biologically based. Where the material science part of my work comes in is when we dry the SCOBY. So when we dry the SCOBY, it results in a material that feels and acts like leather. And so for me, because I'm a material scientist, I can actually test the mechanical properties of this material. So I can figure out its strength, its flexibility, its brittleness, all of these different properties. And through this testing, I found that not only does this leather, but it actually has the same mechanical properties as animal and plastic-based leathers. So going back to this application of the SCOBY breastplate, we grow the SCOBY, we then harvest it and dry it around a mannequin to give it this breastplate shape. And within the breastplate, we embed a strand of LED lights, and we connect these LEDs to this touch sensor. And so this touch sensor, which is the black piece you see along the bottom of the breastplate, is actually a SCOBY that we coated in activated charcoal. And activated charcoal is really interesting because it is electrically conductive, so that's how it can, sense, but it is still completely biodegradable. So that allows us to create this completely biodegradable sensing piece. So when we connect our sensor to our LEDs, we code it so that the pressure and length of touch correlates to the brightness and length of LED illumination. So a very light tap on that sensing piece will result in a short, dim flash of the LEDs. But if you apply a lot of pressure to the touch and you touch for a long period of time, the LEDs will glow very brightly and their glow will kind of linger for a longer period of time. So now that I've kind of introduced myself and where my research is situated, I want to introduce you all to 3 of the living biomaterials I work with a lot in my lab. So the SCOBY, of course, is one of these living materials. I also work a lot with dinoflagellates, which are a type of bioluminescent algae, and mycelium, which hopefully you will all have heard of. And mycelium is basically the root structure of fungus. So going back to the SCOBY, of course, it's made up of this bacteria and yeast that grows in tea and then turns into this leather when we dry it. So this is how the breastplate looks when it's all laid out. So as you can see here, we have this tiny little microcontroller and battery that connects the LEDs to the sensitive SCOBY along the center of the breastplate. Another great thing about the SCOBY is that once it's dry, it's completely biodegradable. So along the top here, you see a sample of just plain SCOBY that was placed in soil, and then I measured its mass over time. So as it degraded, as all the microorganisms in the soil was eating away at it, it was losing mass. So I found that in just 30 days, the SCOBY degraded 96%. I ran this same test with a sample of SCOBY that was coated in that activated charcoal. So this is mimicking how that touch sensor would biodegrade. And we found that in 30 days, the activated charcoal SCOBY would degrade 84%. So another living organism I work with is dinoflagellates, which are a bioluminescent algae that glow when physically stimulated. So when you have the lights on, these dinoflagellates basically just look like water. They're a type of microalgae, so we can't see them with our bare eyes. But when we turn off the lights, we can actually see that when we shake them, when we physically stimulate them, they start to glow in reaction to all that oxygen being incorporated into the water. So this work, which was led by my lab mate, Netta Offer, was all about creating different interactive games with the bioluminescent algae. So we placed them in these tiny little closed petri dishes to create a glow-in-the-dark checkers game. We also found that the dinoflagellates could survive in foam. So we soaked foam with the dinoflagellates and turned them into a hopscotch game. So then when you stepped on each foam piece, the dinoflagellates would glow. And we also created a basic ball game where we would toss different ping pong balls into the bowls of dinoflagellates to make them glow. The third living biomaterial I want to talk about today is mycelium, which, as I said, is the root-like structure of fungi. And they grow in various types of biological media. So in these petri dishes here, we have our mycelium growing on a coffee agar mixture, but they are most commonly grown in like a hemp or wood chip mixture. And so what we can do is we can shape this inoculated wood chip mixture into a mold, and we created a bunch of different types of household items. So bowls, cups, we made a bunch of jewelry, we made a bunch of household decor. And with this work, we actually turned our experiences with growing mycelium during the pandemic into a at-home DIY cookbook. So you can follow along recipes to design your own mycelium artifacts. So now that I've introduced you to the 3 different types of living biomaterials, I want us all to play a game because I don't like just talking at people and I want this to be interactive. So the job of a biodesigner or a designer in general is to kind of map which materials can be used for different applications. And that's most of my job. I just figure out, what application would be best suited for what materials we have in the lab. So the first question I have for you all is, which living biomaterial or biomaterials would you want to wear? So we're thinking about different kind of clothing applications. So in the chat, I would love it if you could throw in your answer. If you are in a classroom, perhaps we could do a quick poll, raise your hands of which material you would think be best to clothing applications. So let's give a minute and see. Okay, we have a mixed bag. We have some mycelium, a few scobies, dinoflagellate, SCOBY. Yeah, SCOBY, it doesn't hurt that I of course showed a wearable application. Okay, the next question is, which biomaterial would you want to live in? So thinking about kind of the future home, so architectural scale, what kind of materials would you want to incorporate into your house? Mycelium. Mycelium's a great answer. There's actually a lot of work being done with architectural scale mycelium, like mycelium bricks and stuff. I would also be very interested in a bunch of dinoflagellate lighting. I think that would be very cool, but I would be living in a very, very dark house all the time. And the third question is, which biomaterial would you want to play with? So thinking about toys and kind of this aspect of play and interactivity. Okay, more mycelium. Ooh, and some dinoflagellates. Yes. Wonderful. Thank you all for being engaged in this. So now I want to introduce kind of the three quote unquote dead biomaterials I work with. So when I say dead, I'm really kind of talking about materials that I have not seen during their living state. So with my living materials, there was very much a caretaking aspect to them. I watched them grow, I had to feed them, I had to make sure that they were still alive. But with these dead biomaterials, by the time I was working with them, the biological base of them, is no longer living. So one example is reclaim, which is a very personal clay-like biomaterial made from my composted food waste. So of course, food, it's obviously a biological material, but by the time I'm eating the food, it's no longer growing. So what we do is we take our food waste and then we degrade it down into compost, which acts as the base of the clay. And then we add sodium alginate, which is an algae extract, and that acts as a binder for the clay. We add calcium carbonate, which is a mineral, and that stabilizes the clay. And then we add water to just combine all these ingredients together. So when we combine all these ingredients together, we end up getting this mixture that we can then kind of sculpt and play with like traditional clays. So to arrive at this recipe for reclaim, I went through multiple iterations. Here are just the 5 major ones I went through, and these recipes range from recipes that had no compost in them whatsoever to recipes that were basically solely comprised of compost. So the recipe that I chose, that was my quote unquote optimal recipe, was mostly made up of compost, but had enough calcium carbonate to kind of keep it stabilized. And this recipe was chosen because it held 3-dimensional shape really well. It felt nice to work with. It felt like kind of traditional sculpting clays I would use in an art practice. And it could be extruded through a piping bag relatively easily. So despite the fact that I arrived at a optimal recipe, I found that the resulting reclaim actually looked very different and had different properties each time I made it. And this was because my food waste was changing every time. So sometimes I would be eating, a lot of egg. So we would see a lot of eggshells in the clay. Sometimes you would see bits of orange peel. Sometimes you would have a very coffee ground heavy clay. And so because my recipe was very inconsistent and was always changing based on what I was eating, I used very hands-on techniques to support the clay instead of, say, like 3D printing the clay. So I relied a lot on my sculpting. I did a lot of molding with it. And then I also did some extruding with like a piping bag for cake icing. One of my favorite applications that came out of this clay project was actually this very silly and fun instrument that I made. And so to make this instrument, I sculpted 2 tiles, which you see my friend touching here. And these tiles have embedded activated charcoal powder in them. So going back to that SCOBY breastplate, we know that the activated charcoal powder is electrically conductive into touch sensors. So when we touch these clay tiles, we can actually program them to create different sounds. So fingers crossed, my sound will work can all hear the instrument. So we were able to get all of these different tones by touching the clay because the activated charcoal did not uniformly mix into the clay. Clay is a very imperfect thing. We, have all this unpredictable food waste going into it. So that's how we were able to get different tones. So we mapped it based on the change of capacitance from wherever we touched the tile. Another amazing thing about the Reclaim project is that the life cycle, its end of life, is completely circular. So, if we start with this food waste from our kitchen and then degrade it and get compost, we can then add our other ingredients to turn that compost into Reclaim. And then once we no longer want Reclaim, we can actually just throw it back into the environment. And because it is mostly made up of compost, the compost actually provides nutrients to help new plants grow. So then we can produce more food, which results in more food waste. Thus, we have this perfectly circular cycle. The next kind of dead biomaterial that I want to talk about is alginol, which is this highly customizable and sustainable algae-based bioplastic that I developed. So alginol is based on other bioplastic recipes that you might see on DIY materials websites like Materium. It is made up of water, agar, and glycerin. And how I differentiate my specific recipe is the fact that I did a ton of testing to optimize it for strength and flexibility. So we were able to adjust the flexibility and strength of the material based on changing the amount of glycerin we added to it. So if we didn't put any glycerin into the recipe, we had a very brittle but very, very strong plastic. So you can think of like a Tupperware application. But if we put a lot of glycerin into the recipe, we had a bioplastic that was so sticky it could stick to windows. So my optimal recipe kind of was a balance of these two. And so how we make it is we combine these three ingredients. We then bring it to a boil, either in a microwave or on a stovetop. And then we pour it out onto a flat surface. And then in 24 to 48 hours, it dries and we can peel it up off of that surface. Although here in Colorado, it is very, very dry. So it only took that 24 to 48 hours. But if you live in a more humid climate, it might take a lot longer. And so once it's dry, we have this piece of bioplastic that acts very similar to kind of a vinyl fabric. So you can think about a raincoat or something. And so once we had our recipe and we had our material, I really looked into different ways of fabricating applications from alginol. So I played a lot with laser cutting and laser engraving the alginol. It can also easily be cut with just scissors or an X-Acto knife. And then I looked at how we combine pieces of alginol together by heat sealing them. So we could heat seal them by simply using a fabric iron, and that fabric iron adds enough heat to just slightly melt the bioplastic so that when it redries, the pieces of bioplastic are sealed together. So through these two techniques, I was able to make a collection of clothing items. So a dress, a t-shirt, a skirt. And then I was also able to create this temperature sensor. And this temperature sensor was made by incorporating thermochromic powders into the recipe during the cooking stage. So this thermochromic powder changes color based on temperature. So through the thermochromic powder and our fabrication techniques, we were able to make this temperature sensing necklace that would change color based on the temperature of the environment you were in. We similarly incorporated a photochromic pigment. So the photochromic pigment changes color based on UV light exposure. So we used this sample to create a bracelet that would change color when you would step into the sunlight. So it kind of gave you a reminder that you needed to put sunscreen. Once we no longer needed our alginol applications, we found a way of recooking it. So we would take our scraps or unwanted or already used alginol and simply reboil our scraps in water. And then we could pour our scraps out onto the table, re-dry it, and we would have a brand new piece of bioplastic. And so this is a great sustainable option for end of life, because we no longer need to source any new materials. We don't need to, find more agar or glycerin. We can simply recook in water. So through this recooking, I made just this basic clear concert bag to take with me around town. In this scenario that we did not want to recook our alginol, we did some testing around the biodegradability. So similar to finding the biodegradability of the SCOBY, we measured the mass loss over time of an alginol sample when it was placed in the environment. So we found that in just 60 days, so 2 months, our piece of alginol degraded 97% in the soil. So the last dead biomaterial that I want to talk about today is my self-destaining textiles project, which are basically these textile interfaces that selectively remove stains based on light exposure. So to do this, we take this commercial nanocoating, and this nanocoating is made up of photocatalytic nanoparticles that basically can adhere to the surface of cotton. And when they adhere to the surface, it does not change the look or feel of the textile. But then when the textile is exposed to light, the nanoparticles start eating away at any types of organic matter. So if we stain a piece of cotton that has been coated in these nanoparticles with coffee, when we expose it to light, all those nanoparticles start eating away at the coffee grounds and degrading the stain. That being said, this process was very slow. So over the course of 36 hours, we could eventually degrade the entire coffee stain. We then applied these textiles to make kind of fun applications to reflect our daily experiences. So this is a hair scrunchie that destains based on how it is worn. So because the fabric is all scrunched up, only parts of the fabric were exposed to light. So when we unraveled it, we got this piece of textile that was patterned based on how we wore the scrunchie. We also were able to selectively remove stains through LEDs. So this is just a basic LED setup we had. And so wherever those LEDs were, we could remove the stains of that part. So this is just a basic little phone case we patterned with using our destaining textile. So you are already familiar with this game. Now that I've introduced the 3 types of dead biomaterials they work with, I want us to run through this same activity. So thinking about the dead biomaterials you would want to wear in application. So yeah, again, my class, we do a raise your hands kind of poll. If you're on, I would love to be in the chat if you have any answers. Awesome. Got some alginol, some of the self-destaining textiles. I personally would love a self-cleaning textile shirt for when I myself. Next question, of course, is thinking about building materials, our future home. Which materials would you want to incorporate into your home? Which ones would you want to live with? Yeah, the clay is definitely a somewhat clear. Self-destaining, like a self-destaining rug or carpets would be nice. A self-destaining couch, perhaps. Wonderful. And lastly, which one would you want to play with? So thinking about those toy applications or play applications. Okay, we have quite a few people. I like that. I didn't have a lot of experience with making clothes before I went and made my alginol clothing. So the first thing I actually did was make doll clothing. Wonderful. Okay, thank you all for participating. So now that we're kind of reaching the end of the talk, I want to just kind of wrap up with some lessons that I learned from designing with all of these different biomaterials. So my first thing is care. Care is very important, and biomaterials require a lot of care. So for the living biomaterials, this is very obvious. You know, I had to make sure that they were still alive. I had to feed them. I had to make sure they weren't contaminated. I had to make sure they had all the right nutrients and right lighting and environmental conditions. But even for my dead biomaterials, I had to kind of find ways of caring for them in the ways I used them and the way I disposed of them. So thinking about the reclaim, finding very hands-on techniques to support the inconsistencies of the material. The second thing is patience. A lot of these biomaterials are very slow. Even the self-destaining textiles, you know, it took a while for them to remove the stains. It took a while for the kombucha SCOBY to grow, you know, on the order of weeks or months to get just one layer of biofilm. I also very much had to embrace a flexible mindset when working with biomaterials because they are very variable. When you're working with a living material, you can't always force it to what you want to do. It is a living thing that has a will of its own. And, you know, going back to those dead biomaterials, there is a lot of unpredictabilities with using, you know, compost in your clay. There's a lot of unpredictabilities in the textiles. Some textiles wouldn't adhere to the nano coating as much as other types of textiles. Interdisciplinarity is really important to develop and work with all these materials. I draw from a lot of different fields. I'm taking a lot of inspiration from, traditional crafting practices, but I'm also applying a lot of my material science knowledge. So I encourage interdisciplinary thinking and design work. And lastly, one of the biggest takeaways I had is that biomaterials are just kind of this one step towards sustainability. So to kind of create this more sustainable world, changing the materials we use to biodegradable materials is obviously very important. But we also need to think around the processes and methods we use in developing these biomaterials, and how we're applying these biomaterials, and how we're disposing of them in the end. So with that all being said, thank you all so much for being an engaging audience and listening to me. I know that was a lot of information with a lot of different materials kind of thrown at you, but I am happy to take questions right now. And please feel free to reach out offline as well. You can email me, tweet at me, DM me on Instagram. You can also follow the work that happens at the lab that I participate in, the Living Matter Lab at CU Boulder.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I'm still kind of similar, like seeking all the ideas that you had, and we've tried some of these things, and they're absolutely fascinating. Um, Thank you so much. And I'm wondering if anybody from the audience have some comments or questions for Fiona that you would like to share.
I've got a question. First off, the destaining, what is when it looked like, or maybe I didn't understand, two different methods that you're using the light to activate when the destaining would occur, but then also would you control where you put that destaining substance, or whatever the proper word is, like where you with it and certain spots, where you also at times put that destaining material on certain parts of the fabric and then light.
Yes, that was a great question. So I could coat the entire textile with the nanoparticles, and you could have like a completely uniform destain if you have uniform light. You can selectively apply the coating to only specific parts of the textile, or you could only specifically expose the textile to light. So in this work, the most common combination that I used was uniformly coating the textile and then controlling the light exposure. But you could also do it the other way and selectively apply the nano coating. So hopefully that answered your question.
We have another question in the chat.
Yes,
Have you or your lab mates experimented with combining any of these materials?
That is a wonderful question. We have just kind of started finding overlaps. One of the combinations that I am really, really curious about is the combination of mycelium and the reclaim compost clay, because I think that would create a really unique, strong building material. But that being said, I would also love to create a wearable made from the alginel that has pockets to hold the dinoflagellate algae. And then you could have this fun, glowing wearable.
That's amazing. We have another question from Anu. This is brilliant. She's sharing. Thank you for sharing. Is it possible to 3D print with bioplastics?
There is a lot of potential for 3D printing with bioplastics. 3D printing currently is an interesting field because a lot of people market like PLA as biodegradable, and in theory, PLA is biodegradable, but you can't just throw it into your backyard and expect it to grade. PLA needs very specific conditions to biodegrade. So creating a more biodegradable bioplastic to 3D print is definitely something I'm interested in. And I haven't done a ton of testing around it yet, but it is on my list of things to do. And I think it is very doable, especially, kind of creating a custom 3D printer, hooking up a syringe and extruding some of that liquid bioplastic to dry. But that is kind of the biggest hurdle, is the drying times for the bioplastic. Otherwise, I would love to 3D print the Reclaim. I want to get my hands on one of those clay 3D printers.
No, we are actually, one of our project is we are working on kind of creating a bioprinter. So hopefully maybe we stay in touch in the future and explore some of these possibilities. I am curious about the conductive SCOBY that you mentioned. From what I heard, it was like a coating. Was the activated charcoal directly into the tea mix? Because when we add like some color, sometimes we mix it with the sweet tea, and I wonder if it was added later or it was just like part of the growing process.
Great question. We added the activated charcoal right when we harvested it. So during the drying process, it would really embed and adhere to the surface of the SCOBY. We did try adding activated charcoal into the tea mixture, but we had a lot of issues around growth and contamination when we did that.
That's helpful to know. I was curious about that process. It's super fascinating. Anybody else have any questions or comments for Fiona? While we're waiting, I have one more. You mentioned about the alginel and its thermoplastic properties. Have you tried? I know like you were mostly pouring it flat, but can that be like used in vacuum forming or other kind of thermoplastic, like heat sealing machines? Have you experimented with some of those things?
We have just started kind of doing the vacuum sealing and kind of trying to form it into these 3D shapes. All of that has to happen once we have a pre-dried sheet of, flat bioplastic. When we went to mold it, kind of during that drying process, the molding didn't work very well, just because the alginel loses a lot of its water content and shrinks a lot when it dries. So if we tried molding, it would deform horribly in whatever mold it was in. But yeah, I think there's a lot of intriguing possibilities around kind of the heat forming.
Another question from Josh again. Back to the stain one. What sort of smell would occur, if any, in an example like the coffee being spilled and being broken down over the 36-hour?
Yes. So when the stain occurs, you of course would smell the coffee, but the staining process, no odor is emitted because the nanoparticles eat away at all types of organic matter. So this includes the stain, This includes any types of microorganisms, bacteria. So it cleans all of that. And that includes any like odor. So it is completely odorless.
Wow, that's so fascinating. We are just at the end of the talk. It's 2:15 now. I wish we had a lot more time, but this was amazing. Absolutely a fantastic experience for myself. I'm sure others are also, if you have read the chat, everybody's like thanking you. Um, we really, really appreciate your time and your creative ideas. And hopefully, this has inspired a lot of our students and teachers to start some of these project ideas, taking inspiration from you. Um, Thank you again, and I hope everybody have a good day.
Thank you
Bye.
so much, everybody. It was great talking. Please feel free to reach out.
Yep, that's correct. And in fact, I connected with Fiona via Twitter, so she's very responsive on any of the social media. So feel free to reach out to her directly.
Thank you.
Fiona, if you want to stay,